Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, I'm Becky Parker Geist, and I'm the host of Audiobook Connection Behind the Scenes with the Creative Teams podcast, and I want to thank you so much for being with me today. I am also the CEO of Pro Audio Voices and Amplify Audiobooks, and the president of Bay Area Independent Publishers Association. So I wear a lot of hats in many different arenas, but they all relate and they're all sort of connected in this world of storytelling, independent publishing, and audiobooks. Some in the theater world as well. Again, I want to just thank you for being with me today. We're going to focus on podcasting. Whether starting a podcast might be the right move for you. So my intention here is to help provide some foundational understanding about why you might want to start a podcast, and so that you can evaluate whether that might be a good move for you. And I'll just put it here as well as at the end of this podcast, that if that is a question that you would like to discuss one-on-one with me or another member of our team at Pro Audio Voices, where we help authors and others set up and get started, as well as to maintain and manage their podcasts. So if that's something that you would like to have a personal conversation with me, I'd be happy to do that. Just go to proaudiovoices.com/get-started, and you'll see where you can sign up to schedule a call with me. All right, let's get into some content here. So, first thing, when you're trying to decide if you want to host a podcast, here are some things you'll want to know. The first thing is it's really helpful to evaluate in advance what gift it is, what content you have that you are wanting to share with the world. Now, as I see it, this is the main reason why anyone would want to do a podcast, is because they have something that they want to share. Now, turn that around, because it's not just about what we want to share. It's about what we want to share that is going to help someone else. Because if we're not helping someone else, then, we're just sort of whistling in the wind. We're not going to have an audience. Think about who is the audience that you would like to speak to, and what it is, what gift you have to share with that audience. This is very much in line with what are your goals for the podcast. But the first place to start is, what do you want to offer? Do you have something that is entertaining? Is it a piece of fiction that you've written? Is it, or ongoing? Maybe it's short stories. Could be poems. What if it's, you're a stand-up comic and you want to provide some humorous content? There's so many different ways to entertain as part of a podcast. And if that might be what your gift is that you'd like to offer. It might be that you have something where you can enlighten. You may be able to provide information, knowledge, analysis of information. These are some of the most interesting podcasts, I think, where experts are really evaluating and analyzing information and then sharing that. It gives us a better insight into whatever that field is. And then there's also the counseling or guiding, the guidance of, where you're providing information that is going to either help with like personal development or business growth or some other ways in which we're trying to learn and grow. And if you're a coach or like a mentor in some way, these are areas of content that can be really, really valuable to people. People are seeking that all the time. And whatever your area of expertise is, there is always room for more content to be out there in your realm. Now, another thing that I find is really helpful in this thinking and this sort of pre-podcast planning session, if you will, in your mind, is why is this important to you? Why is it important to you to share this gift? This is always a great question to ask yourself, whether you're thinking about a podcast or anything else that you're doing. I'll give an example from my own life, something that I found was really important to me. And that was when my father was in the last stages of his life, and he was ill with cancer. And he had written a few books, and I had offered to turn those into audio. And I did that for one of his books, The Crow's Nest. And I knew that it was, that he was near the end, we could tell. And so I was trying to get those recorded for him and sent over to him as quickly as I could. He lived in New Jersey. I was in California. So I was sending them over the internet. And my sister-in-law let me know that when they played those audios for him, that his face just lit up. And I could imagine it. Even though I wasn't there, I could see it in my mind's eye, this lighting up from this experience of listening to the audio. And that, for me, early on, was an important piece of my why. Why it was important for me to focus on bringing stories to life in audio. I see it as a way to break through the confines of time and space and to have my energy, my storytelling, my spirit carry through and transport someone else as they're listening to it in some other time and place. That's an amazing, sort of miraculous experience to me. So thinking about my dad was one of the inspiring forces in my life, or in those moments when I realized how important that was, how valuable the gift that I had to share was. So you may have an experience or more experiences. I had several, but that was one that was really sort of a key for me. You may have something in your life that helps you stay focused on this moving forward with your goal. Now, here's one reason why I think it's good to know your why, what it is that will keep you moving forward. First of all, it's always a good exercise to ask that question, to understand what it is that motivates us. Because we all have the times in our lives where maybe it's a little harder to do the thing that we're trying to do, the thing that we've been focused on, our creative energy moving forward. Sometimes it feels hard. Sometimes we have moments of discouragement. Sometimes it just feels like, oh gosh, can I really keep going at this thing? In those moments in particular, it's so valuable to remember why it is. Because what we're doing then, by having that identified experience, then we're able to reconnect with that. And the reconnecting with that is what can help us move forward and stay focused and keep going. In particular, in relating to podcasting, when we do a podcast, especially if it's an episodic podcast, it's going to keep going on and on, then there is a commitment, right, to developing that content week after week or month after month, depending upon, what your schedule is and everything. When I say schedule, I mean the podcast schedule. How frequently you have to come up with the next piece of content. Knowing that why can really help you in that big picture of your podcasting. So that's why I'm bringing it up in this context. Let's just take a short pause and we'll come right back. And we're going to talk about the types of podcasts and some other things that I think will be helpful for you to know as you get started.
Are you considering starting your own podcast? or already have a podcast that you'd like support with. At Pro Audio Voices, we customize every proposal to ensure you get the support you need. Want social media support to get you launched and rolling with a fast-growing audience? No problem. Need a podcast manager to keep you on track and manage all the post-production and posting of each episode? We've got you. Looking for guidance or a mentor to ensure your growth? At Pro Audio Voices, we're committed to your success. Schedule a call with one of our team to discuss your podcast project today.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the kinds of podcasts that there are so you can understand what your options are. There are two basic buckets of podcasts in terms of I'll just say type, but that's not quite the right word. So there are serial podcasts and there are episodic podcasts. Serial podcasts have a fixed number of episodes and then they're done. And if you were to podcast out your audiobook, that would be a serial, and then it just ends. That would be a serial podcast. The other version is an episodic podcast. That's the one that most of us are familiar with. It's an ongoing podcast. Yes, many podcasts will eventually come to an end for some reason. The host decides that they need to stop or, have some health crisis or any number of other things. Or maybe, they decide to stop for whatever reason. If, depending on what you're interested in or thinking about, I'll describe a little bit more about the serial podcasts first. This is going to most often be best for authors who have an audiobook. And I know that is a lot of our audience here. And so with this, sometimes you would include a little recap, like they do sometimes on a Netflix series or something like that, where they give you the highlights of what happened last episode so that you are up to speed as you listen to this next one. Now, you can do that, but you don't have to. Totally up to you. And it will depend partly on your content and how important that is. And it could be done on some episodes, but not on others. Another thing to factor in is if your podcast is going to be weekly, then your listeners aren't having to wait quite so long for the next episode. If it's monthly, I would recommend a recap because that's a pretty long time for listeners to go before, when they're trying to remember what happened before. A lot of life has happened in the course of a month, right? For them to remember what was happening in your audiobook. So those are some things to consider. With a serial podcast, you may be thinking, many authors do, they question whether they really want to put it out there, their entire audiobook out there for free. Now, you don't have to put the whole audiobook out, but I want to say this with a caveat, and that is that if you engage your listeners and you lead them to believe that they're going to be able to listen to the whole thing for free, and then you cut them off and you say to hear the rest of the audiobook, you have to buy it, you might end up with some angry followers, right? Many people are used to free content, and there is value in that. So I'll talk a little bit about how to make that even more valuable. But I recommend if you are going to cut them off near the end, that you let them know at the very beginning. Set their expectations appropriately so that when they get to that point, they will understand that in order to hear the ending, they're going to have to buy the audiobook or however else you want to deliver it, to generate a little bit of revenue for that audio content. Now, if you're listening or if you're going to post the whole audiobook as your podcast, you can do that also, but use the podcast itself still to drive sales for your audiobook. How do you do that? Well, think about the fact that if all of your episodes aren't out yet and somebody wants to listen to the next episode, they want to hear the whole thing, they're willing to do it, episode by episode, but they're eager. That's a good thing. In your podcast, you can have an ad for the audiobook or your print book or some other book that you have or a coaching service you have or anything else because it's your podcast. You control the content. So in that podcast, it gives you an opportunity to promote something else outside the podcast. That can be really valuable. If you're an author with a series, you could podcast out your entire first book in the series and use that as leverage to promote your other books, the next books in the series. And you can do it in every episode. Okay. Let's look to the episodic episodes or episodic podcasts and talk a little bit more about those. With the episodic one, of course, you're doing an ongoing podcast. This is where it's really helpful if you are connected with your passion as to why you want to do this work, get this content out there, because it can be a lot, can feel like a lot to maintain, to develop, create the content on a consistent schedule. And consistency is important. Everyone in the marketing world that I've ever heard talk about this, they always say consistency is important. So if you're not sure if you can keep up the pace with a weekly podcast, don't jump into that yet. Start monthly or start every other week. And then if you want to increase your frequency after a while, that's fine. You can do it. You're actually better off creating content well in advance. So it's a good idea to have multiple episodes that are already ready to rock, ready to roll, ready to release before you even start your podcast. And then get those scheduled out so that if you get sick or something happens and, maybe you take a vacation and you're already booked a few episodes ahead, then you can do that without too much stress. All right? So keep that in mind. Always good to have those extra episodes available, ready to go as you get started. Okay, now, there are some different types of, that word types is, it keeps coming up, and I wish I had a different word for it, but there are some other ways in which to do a podcast, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the content itself. So one type of content would be, for example, tips or the sharing of information that is going to be helpful to your listeners. That would, and I'm talking here about primarily like a single host focused podcast, very similar to what I'm doing right now. One person sharing some information in a podcast. Another version that we see a lot is the interview version, when that is where you host a podcast and on at least some, if not all of your episodes, you're interviewing someone else. There's a lot of value in that. In one way, they are also typically helping you spread the word, or should be. If you're ever a guest on a podcast, I strongly encourage you to help the podcast host spread the word about the episode that you record as a guest with them. The interview is a great way to do it. It can be with one other person or multiple people, whatever works for you. Or another kind of podcast might be where you have more than one host. Maybe you have two hosts or three hosts even, where it's a conversation. And those can be really engaging, as long as you are talking about something interesting and not just, kind of rambling on without providing any actual content. I have listened to some of those, and what I find is I stop listening pretty quickly if they're not really saying much of anything that's of interest. So, just listening to people talk in and of itself, not so interesting. Make sure that you're talking about things that will be of interest to people. And then yet another version, and we are producing one of these podcasts, Spill the Tea with the Top-Notch Dogs. And that is a podcast that grew out of an audiobook production. The main characters are dogs. And the podcast is the dogs as hosts. And the dogs interview other characters, and it's a way to have a scripted podcast with professional narrators who are talking about content that, again, is going to be of some value and interest to the audience. So those are some different types of podcast episodes that you can consider in terms of your content. And then again, for this episode here, I just want to wrap up with a reminder about frequency of your podcast. Do you want to, and would you be able to keep up the pace of a weekly podcast? Or will that feel like just too much? Start where you can comfortably start. Don't try to overdo it or you'll wear yourself out. So take it at a pace that feels like it works for you. Thank you so much for being with me today. Again, if you'd like to chat about your podcast ideas, if that is something that you have questions about or would like to learn about how Pro Audio Voices could support you in your podcasting endeavor, please reach out to us at proaudiovoices.com. Thanks again for being with me. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.